happens when the state tries to outsmart the market. You get the 2008 housing crash, a $1 trillion bailout culture, and a social security system running on the logic of a legal Ponzi scheme. But the market always finds a way. Today, we are looking at the ultimate rebellion against central planning, the fight for currency competition. Can Bitcoin or a return to the gold standard strip the Federal Reserve of its power to inflate away your purchasing power? Plus, we'll tackle the ultimate economic shutdown. Did COVID lockdowns actually save lives, or did they just crush small businesses while centralizing corporate power? It's time for some economic reality. Let's dive in. So welcome to the second official episode of the Economic Forum podcast. I'm your host, Gabriel, and today we are tackling four of the biggest economic debates of our generation from a free market perspective and from a progressive perspective. I can assure you that this podcast is anything but an echo chamber, as I'm joined by a panel with very different ideas on how the world should work. Joining me today are Sai, Kartik, and Tarso to discuss how we should tackle these pressing issues. Today, we're going to talk about the 2008 housing crash, the looming crisis of Social Security, competition in currency through crypto and the gold standard, and the real impact of COVID lockdowns. Now we will have each panelist give a short 10-second introduction. I'm Gabriel, and my perspective of economic theory is I believe in free markets and supply and demand.
I'm Kartik, and my stance is neutral.
I'm Sai. I believe in a free market economy with a robust social safety net.
I'm Tarso, and I'm economically progressive.
All right, so let's get into it. The first topic today is the 2008 housing crisis. So before we get into our individual views of the crisis, let's just go over some basic realities of what happened. So just for everyone viewing today, the crash happened. It was 2008. It was a crash where banks started getting filing bankruptcy through Chapter 11, and it was a crisis for the entire economy, so much so that the banks had to get bailed out, right? This was caused by mortgage-backed securities collapsing. This was caused by CDOs collapsing. These were mortgages held by big banks because they thought that mortgage prices wouldn't go down, or, we'll talk about the different causes, but the primary reason is housing prices went down, mortgages went down, and these big banks had their portfolios heavily dependent on these mortgages. When they crashed, the banks crashed. So today we want to talk about basically the causes of it and why it happened. Who wants to start?
I'll start. It's these banks, they collapsed because they began issuing subprime mortgages, to unreliable buyers. These people had, no bad credit history, and yet they still got these highly risky loans. And so as a result, when they all eventually defaulted, the banks lost money and eventually had to close, causing this crisis.
Yeah, I think my biggest take in this situation is how banks weren't regulated enough regarding subprime mortgages and mortgages that didn't really they couldn't pay off their mortgage. So my biggest opinion in this part is the improper regulation, and also how the government bailed out banks.
Yeah, I think the main reason why the mortgages were getting low is because the government kept encouraging high risk taking to, what Kartik said, low credit people around the country, and they just couldn't pay it off in time, causing the crash.
Yeah. So I think before we go any more, I think it's important to understand the history of the crisis. You had the dot-com bubble. So for our viewers, the dot-com bubble was when over-speculation in the internet industry, it sparked, and what happened was there was a big crash after that because the speculation was over-speculating, right? And what the Fed had to do was the Fed had to slash interest rates, or they did slash interest rates to 1% and held them there. What that does is that incentivizes investment. But it held those rates all the way up until 2009 into this crisis. And these low rates were incentivizing bad investment, right? Because when these rates are so low, money is much cheaper, meaning that the banks were lending out for cheaper. And you had things like the Community Reinvestment Act. You had things like HUD sponsoring Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac because politicians are the goal of a politician is to get reelected, right? That's the goal of a politician. And to get reelected, you need something to brag about. And people brag about a lot of different things, but at the time, housing was viewed as very important to people, homelessness, poverty. So politicians had an incentive to say, hey, we want to make housing cheaper for people. But they didn't actually want to do that because if you make housing cheaper, property values go down. And who are the funders of these politicians? Rich people. They don't want their property values to go down. So what they do instead is they say, okay, so instead banks, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to lend out riskier mortgages so these people with lower income, they're going to be the ones who have to lend out to these lower income people, and they're going to be able to buy these loans not because they're financially secure or because homing prices are lower, but just because banks allow them to on these very risky mortgages. And banks are happy with it because they're sponsored by the government, and they always will have a market, which is the government. And
so, what are your thoughts on government regulation before 2008? Do you think they should have been?
It was way too strict, 100%.
Too strict, really? Why?
100%. So the housing crisis was localized. This was not a nationwide thing. It happened in California, Florida, Arizona were the three primary states. What happened? Well, the reason for those was very strict zoning laws, primarily raising housing prices exorbitantly. Politicians recognized that. They wanted to keep the zoning laws strict because they wanted to have their funders make money on their properties. Their funders are landowners, right? Rich property owners. If they go down, and if properties go down in value, the rich don't like that, so they tell government, I want you to keep these property values raising. They can't do that simultaneously while allowing the lower income people to be able to afford housing. So they say to banks, lend out to these people anyway, even though it's risky. Still lend out to them.
What about
forcing banks?
Subprime mortgages? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, should the government have been regulating
the government caused it.
Banks on?
Government caused it. Government.
Well, yeah, yes, but could they also have renting it too?
They stated quotas. They said they wanted them to lend out the subprime mortgages. Government said.
Oh yes.
Freddie Mae and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were two government organizations, and these organizations had quotas set by HUD, which is a government agency, and 56% of the loans that those companies bought had to be subprime, required. So these banks said, okay, well, this company will guaranteed buy my subprime loans, so I'm going to keep making them and just flipping them. So they wouldn't hold them because the banks knew they were risky. So they would get them, they'd get the loans, package them into this big financial package, and sell them off to the government. And then other banks realized that this was lucrative, and then private banks started to create this. So this entire thing started with government and then expanded into the private sector because the private sector said, look, if government is with us, if government is doing this, and we also profit off of it, government isn't going to let this whole thing crash and burn. And they were actually right when Bear Stearns collapsed and the government bailed them out. So the banks were right in that.
Yeah.
But then the government acted inconsistently because then they let Lehman Brothers go down. And then the whole banking system went into a frenzy because they didn't know who's the government going to bail out.
Or not, yeah.
Who are they not going to bail out? People didn't know what bank they should trust. People started taking out a lot of money out of the banking system. And it just caused that whole collapse that ended up ensuing.
Kartik, what are your thoughts?
Well, like what April said, it's a government intervention that eventually led to the housing crisis in general. And also, when interest rates spiked, millions of homeowners, because of those subprime mortgages, they all ended up defaulting and resulted in these banks losing money and then all closing. And then some of them got bailed out, some of them didn't, and it resulted in more people taking out more money.
Yeah. Tarso?
Yeah, I feel like this was just a big snowball effect. Some famous people kept taking their money out, just kept going more and more, creating moral hazard. I feel like, that was just a fact of it.
Yeah. And another thing, too, was the SEC had this regulation called NRSOs, right? These are government-backed organizations, not funded by the government, but they are basically licensing agreements. The government says, okay, these bonds had ratings, by the way, right? So these bonds were rated AAA, the safest, the most secure, even though they weren't. But ratings agencies gave them, the banks, these high ratings because the banks just bought the ratings, right? Now, on the surface, it looks like, oh, that's corruption. That's something the government should regulate, right? The reality behind that is that these were government-sponsored entities. In a free market, these companies would have said, yeah, we're not going to give you these bought ratings because what will happen is when these ratings really crash, that's going to be a massive reputation hurt to us, and nobody's ever going to trust us again. But the reality is that government made it so that way only 3 organizations had the right to rate these bonds. It was Fitch, Standards & Poor, and Moody's. So these banks couldn't go no other ratings agency could come out and do anything. So competition was only among 3 individual firms. So that's why there was so much bureaucracy and corruption within that.
So what are your thoughts on the bank bailouts after 2009? Do you think if they bailed out too many banks, should they have even occurred in the first place, or should they have let them fail?
So I think that's a really interesting situation where we need to let banks fail. The reason, and I think we should have put money into the economy, meaning not allowed our currency to deflate, right? We don't want inflation, but we also don't want deflation. That's what led to the Great Depression. So we want to keep the monetary system stable, but we don't want to pick winners and losers. The government was picking winners and losers. It picked Bear Stearns as a winner, and it picked Lehman Brothers as a loser. It let them go under.
Yeah.
I think that bailouts, what they are, is giving what it was privatization of the profit and socializing of the loss. So it was basically saying, if you succeed, you get a bunch of benefit. But if you fail, then all of us will come together to help back you.
Yeah.
Right? And ultimately, that came at the harm of the taxpayer. Because people say, oh, well, these banks had to pay them back. True, the banks had to pay the government back, but none of that money went back to the taxpayers who ended up paying for
So how could the monetary system how could it have be kept stable even if we didn't bail out the banks? How else could we have kept the banking system stable?
So a good example of that, actually, and this crisis was worldwide, right? Because these banks were not just in the United States. You had banks everywhere, and all of them were purchasing these mortgage-backed securities. A good example is Iceland. So unlike the U.S., Iceland let its 3 largest banks crash in 2008, and they placed them in a receivership and wrote them a domestic consumer check. So Iceland let these banks fail and just controlled its monetary supply. And Iceland's economy boomed after the crash. It went down, obviously, like it does.
Yeah.
But the banks, think about it. When a bank files bankruptcy, it has to sell all of its assets. All of its assets are being sold for pennies on the dollar. That lets smaller banks buy these assets and expand. So now you're letting smaller banks expand into this economy, and you have it being replaced. It's not like this bank goes down, now this bank is taken out of the market. The bank just gets bought by somebody else who can afford it.
How did they keep that? How did they allow citizens to keep money? How did they send that money back to citizens without having them lose money?
They didn't send them. They didn't bail them out.
Okay, but
they didn't use the citizens' money to give it back to them.
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
So, but okay.
Yeah. So, anybody else have any final points before we go on to the next topic?
Nope.
No? All right. So, let's go on to Social Security. So, Social Security, as we know, is it's a program.
$14 trillion problem across the world.
It's a system where we try to fund our older populations, right? It's a welfare system that we spend around 30 to 40% of our national budget on. It's a big enterprise, and we're just before we get into the specifics about it, it's a system where we, as younger people, as workers, pay into this fund, and this fund is used to help older people, right? And now, given that, I'd like to open it up to the panel.
It's gonna fail. It's the truth of it, because before, when it was initially set up, there were far more young workers to support each old person who ended up receiving that Social Security. I think 4 or 5 workers per person it helped, but nowadays it's there's far fewer young people being born and who now can fill that need. That's 1.9 workers, I think, for each old person who receives Social Security. Like, and that number is going down too. So like at this rate, like the entire system is just going to collapse.
Yeah. I have a question and something to say. So my question is more so for you. Have they been moving the date of failure back and back over time? You know, I'm not sure. Like,
I'm not.
Right now it's
sure
2033, but I'm not sure if they're like moving it back.
They
adjusting
also
the funds.
keep printing money
Yeah.
to prevent the failure.
Yeah.
So I'm not exactly sure. I mean, that's totally up to federal government discretion. So,
And my opinion is that we should raise retirement age, or at least have a system like Denmark and Sweden where they have a variable age. So as the population gets older, the age gets older as well, and that's based on their census.
I used to think that Social Security was that like a business would take a little bit of your money that you earned each year and kind of give it to you after you retire. But I guess that's not the case. And yeah, I feel like it's definitely gonna crash if it keeps continuing like this because they're not gonna be able to fund the older population. So yeah, I think I would agree with Sai. We could either raise the retirement age or maybe like personal accounts. I feel like that'd be better. Like each individual, like they fund themselves in a way.
I completely agree with Tarso on this. We need the abolition of the Social Security system.
Yeah.
Not only is it a massive drain on our budget, which that money could be spent on paying our debt, but it's not very efficient. It's not helping retired people and older people in the way that it should be, and it's not sustainable. Market rates, if these people had invested the same amount of money that they invest in Social Security, if they invested that into the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ or the Dow Jones, they would be significantly more wealthy, right? Because private businesses, obviously, it's better. So the funny thing is that this is literally a Ponzi scheme. It's a pay it forward system.
Yeah.
That if any private individual tried to do, it would be illegal, and the government would come and knock on your door and take all your money. But when the government does it, it's not illegal because it's the government, obviously. So I think that's
So is part of your core argument
contradictory.
here about freedom over money, like freedom over your own money?
yes, and also
I understand.
it's not working. So
Yes.
I mean, freedom over your money, but also if I wanted to, let's say I'm rich, right, and I had a disease where I was going to die, right, in 10 years, I don't know. Why is my money being taken from me to pay for my retirement? Because that's how they claim. They say that Social Security is meant to pay for your retirement. It's paying somebody else's retirement.
Someone else, yeah.
Right? So it's not paying for mine. And I'm going to die in 10 years. What's the point of me paying into the system? The whole thing is you pay into the system so that way when you retire, you'll also have somebody else paying in the system that'll...
We're not going to that, yeah.
But that's not even... Not only is that not sustainable, but why is it right for us to say to this person who's dying... take this % of your income, pay Social Security, even though
you won't get it.
Not only will you not get it, it's also like I have 10 years to live. Why am I paying for my retirement?
I think it also comes from like the morality of the people on the left. Like even me, like I'm more left, and it's not even about when I think about it logically. I think that this is all great stuff. I think that your ideas are great stuff, but from my perspective, I feel like the morality of letting these people who are probably not going to invest and probably not going to have nothing, rather have control over their money. That's where my desire for Social Security to stay comes from.
And I can sympathize with that because I also have sympathy for the poor, right? A lot of people think, look, free market economists hate the poor, and what they want to do is just let the poor fail because they're just failures in life. It's not really the case. Poverty is a negative externality.
Really?
It's not really the case. You have we do want to punish failure because that's how you incentivize success. But we don't want to allow people to die on the streets, and poverty overall is a negative externality to society. So
Poverty then leads to crime.
Exactly. And I think that a much better solution would be to say, go after and minimize the welfare state to something like a negative income tax, which would provide a base. It's kind of like a UBI, but not really. So right now there is a welfare cliff in the United States. You make a lot of money in value from welfare. I think it's in New York City that you get around $50,000 to $45,000 to $50,000 in welfare subsidies if you make zero money. That's possible. For you, if you claim maximum welfare coverage, you can get around $45,000 to $60,000 in value, not cash, but value through Section 8, etc. Now, somebody who's working in New York to make that same amount of money in value would have to make $80,000, $90,000. And these are facts. These are statistics that are real.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's fair. But I also don't think that we should be allowing people to starve on the side of the street.
So what are your thoughts on like most people are not financially literate. I think we can
Yeah,
say
they
that.
just lose all of it. Like we're
So
giving
like,
to
how do
people
we
who just
make
lose
sure
it.
that they don't fail?
So I don't think you can force people not to fail. First,
Besides, Social Security kind of does that.
it's not really working. So what you had is after we installed Social Security, you had less poverty rates among the elderly. That's true.
Yeah.
So now what people want to compare is like, okay, well, this was a good thing then. What they're also not comparing is, okay, we could have a free market with a minimal subsidy, like a negative income tax, which helps people with basic needs and doesn't subsidize a $60,000 lifestyle, right? That would be a much better solution than just this Ponzi scheme that we're currently operating under and this massive welfare bureaucracy where 70% of our budget is spent on entitlements. 70%.
Is it really?
It is.
70 is based
70%
of our
entire
government
budget. Yes,
is
yes.
entire budget is 70%
Medicare,
is-
Medicaid, Social Security, and other entitlement programs are close to 70% of the budget. Yeah,
Really? Wow.
60 to 70%. Yeah. So, I mean, what are our final thoughts on this on Social Security, on how we help the elderly in a efficient way that's not economically catastrophic, but it's also not, what some people would call cold.
Go ahead.
I feel like this is a good thing, but it just needs to be changed. Like helping the poor, helping the elderly, they're all good things, but it just needs to be reformed and changed in a way that would actually help them more and help everybody in general.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we need to strike a balance between nurture, as in like helping them out with their money, maybe a Social Security-esque system that maybe helps them out, planning retirement, but also allows them to have control over their money, like you said before.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to strike a balance. I'm not sure what solution would create that, but I think striking a balance is important to make sure people don't fail, but also allowing them to have freedom over their money.
Yeah, it's a good concept, but like right now it's not like working at all because like in New York, it doesn't make sense as to why a person who doesn't work a job can make up like 6,000 like assets and like help, but like someone who actually is trying to work a job and like get money ends up suffering more than that person, which goes against like the entire idea of incentivizing them to make money.
Exactly, and that's definitely a true. In fact, that is so true that I have my grandma is a cleaning lady, right? She doesn't make a lot of money, and she would benefit from welfare entitlements. She doesn't find it moral to take the entitlements.
Really?
She doesn't find it moral. Now, they may help her, but when she went to them originally, to the government, and asked for help in certain areas, they told her she made too much.
Wow.
She lives in an apartment, a small apartment, that does not make a lot of money. She works 3 jobs, right? And she makes too much money. So that's what's causing this cliff is that people are incentivized to stay in welfare because even if they make a little bit more, now their help decreases dramatically. So now they have to make a lot more money for them to be incentivized to get off welfare, which isn't the reality for most poor people.
It's kind of like a trap, no?
It is a trap right now. So if we were to argue for a shift to a more to a less steep welfare cliff, if we wanted to argue for something like a negative income tax, then I think that would be much better. I don't think we have time to go into the negative income tax and the intricacies of that. But the viewers can look it up for themselves. It was a policy advocated by Milton Friedman, a very good policy, mind you. And I think that's my personal solution to poverty in general, including welfare, including the elderly. But a solution in the way maybe you would like is maybe you create a mandated system where people have to spend a certain amount of their money in the private sector, in the S&P or in bonds or something
that could be
else.
good, actually.
Or like
that would be a retirement account rather than this kind of pay it forward system that we currently have. So that could be have another system, right? I wouldn't prefer it, but it'd be much better than the system that we currently have.
And it would also be kind of be striking more of a balance too, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
But between our two two greatest concerns.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back with our next 2 topics. Hello, we're back. Now we're going to be talking about currency and competition. Included in this would be things like Bitcoin, the gold standard that we used to be on as a country versus the fiat system that we're currently under, and how we should navigate the current monetary system? Should it be completely left up to the Federal Reserve and what they think is best for the economy? Should it be based on a monetary physical asset like gold? Or should it maybe be focused on something like a fixed rate of increase, right, where we increase the money supply by 3% a year instead of having it be discretionary? Or do we shift our economy to Bitcoin like some of the Southern American countries? So opening it up to the panel, what do we think about competition in currencies? What do we think about the gold standard, fixed rate increase of the monetary supply? What do we think about that?
I think the gold standard is definitely a really good idea. Like, I don't really go with like the Bitcoin, like the digital art stuff. I feel like that's just really risky, and I don't know. I feel like it's making money out of nothing. But the gold standard, right? You can't print gold. You can't really like inflate that as much as you could money with just printing it out. So I know it'd be hard, but going back to the gold standard, that would be really good for the economy, I feel like.
Yeah, because like just shifting to like a crypto-based economy is like crypto-based currencies are way too volatile for that. Like stocks are like volatile, but like cryptocurrency is way more volatile. Like their price can like just shift like in an instant, like this. So like, in contrast to gold, which historically has maintained like a very high value, like all throughout human history, and like it's also like the classic. So we view like most countries recognize gold as a currency. Actually, think all of them do. But like, yeah, going back to a gold standard, like because we. I don't know what else to say. To be
It's all right. Yes, I also don't really know too much about this topic either. I think that I do view cryptocurrencies as volatile and kind of dangerous, but I also see that they're limited too. So we don't see those swings as much as in other currencies. But I want to hear your views first.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that cryptocurrency is definitely very risky and unproven to set an entire economy on it.
Yeah.
And traditionally, there are many free market economists and even progressive economists that think we should shift to the gold standard. Thomas Sowell is one of those advocates, and Thomas Sowell is one of the most free market economists that still lives today.
Everyone else is dead? Everyone else?
No, I'm just saying one of the most prolific advocates of free markets.
Still around.
Yeah,
okay.
Like he's very against very free market oriented basically, and he's for a gold standard.
So they're also alive though, mostly.
What do you mean?
The economists.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of economists. No, I'm just saying that.
Okay,
this
go on. Bad joke. This is a bad joke.
Okay, it's fine. No, so specifically, moving back to the gold standard, I think it's not a perfect idea. I don't think it's a great idea. It may be well better than our current system, but I think the issue is that you're relying a lot on a physical product like gold and the rate at which it can be mined and the amount that we have as a country that we're lending out, right? So if we can only acquire 3% in gold a year, that's as much as our economy can grow. But if our economy is growing at 10% or is trying to expand, then your monetary system is not expanding enough to match the growth, the innovation. Our modern economy is built a lot on debt. And you would have a massive shrinking of the current system under a gold standard. Now, is it a better system than the current fiat system? Possibly. But I think a better system is just say to the Fed, decrease the Fed's discretionary abilities, and just say to the Fed, listen, you have to print 3% a year, and that's it. You can't print more, you can't print less. Between maybe, or you could even do a range. You could do 2% to 3%. Or something like that, and also allowing for competing currencies, because if the and not so selectively solely choosing the U.S. dollar, because let's say our economy is growing at 10% a year and we're only putting 2% a year new money, you're going to see a deflationary spike. But if there's another currency that's getting printed faster, the economy will shift toward that currency while that's more profitable. And then if we start to go back to the inflationary style, they'll go back to the U.S. dollar. So allowing competition in currencies is actually good. Just like you want competition in products, it creates better products. So allowing competition, but also keeping that steady monetary system as a base in case those other systems fail is definitely a good idea, in my opinion.
So you mentioned having the Fed not print like as volatile as it.
Well, the Fed doesn't print money; the Mint does, but they control the amount of money that banks are allowed to borrow, and it's a very complex system.
Okay.
The Fed is not very simple. It's much too complicated to explain in this conversation. But yes, they do control the price of money, which can inflate the economy or deflate the economy.
So why should they be, if we are on gold standard, why would it be positive for them to be capping that at 3%?
No, I'm saying we wouldn't be on a gold standard in that system. It would be fiat system, but it'd be a regulated fiat system. Where we would only be increasing at between 3 and 4%, 2 and 4%, something like that. Not allowing us to go 0 or 10% printing money just to get us through. Because what that causes is governments like, oh, wait, we can't pay for this? Okay, we'll just print a ton of money and inflate the economy. And they don't care because they just want to get their political objectives done, right? Because they're not in politicians care much more about what they can feed people and tell people to get reelected than what's actually good for people. A good example of this is politicians much rather tell a pretty lie than tell the ugly truth, right? And I think that's just a simple reality, and we did see it. We saw it during the 2008 crisis as we were speaking about before, where you saw the Fed keep interest rates at 1%. This was disastrous for the economy. And the best economists were in the Fed saying that this is a good idea, but it clearly wasn't. It didn't.
Why wasn't it?
It didn't pan out. Well, because, again, it incentivized malinvestment in the economy. I don't want to go back to the other topic.
I think we already talked about it.
We did talk about it before, but it did incentivize malinvestment. And the interest rates should be determined by the market. If people are seeing that they want to invest more, then you're going to see interest rates lower. If they're saving more money, interest rates are going to go up. So that can be regulated by the market. It was before the Fed. It was regulated by the market. After the Fed, it became discretionary. And I think allowing a few elites to decide what they think is best for the economy in certain situations is not necessarily as good as the market, because that gets to centralized authority being better than dispersed authority, which is the idea of the atomization of knowledge. That's the theory created by F.A. Hayek, very famous Austrian economist, the creator of the Austrian school, largely. It was Mises, but then he was the big icon. And he basically stated, central planners can have a lot of knowledge, but maybe each person in their individual field has more knowledge about their own wants, their own desires, and that's why the market is so efficient at creating wealth rather than centralized planning. Like we've had for most of human history, atomization of knowledge, capitalism, the market has created the most innovation and taken the most amount of people out of poverty.
I have to ask a question. You mentioned like a fiat system earlier. I don't have the most amount of knowledge like on this topic specifically. Can you explain what that is?
A fiat system is just a system of money that's backed by the integrity of the government. It isn't backed by a specific asset like gold. It's not backed on anything. It's backed on the credibility of itself, basically.
All right.
Yeah, so what are your thoughts on the Fed overall in this current system? Like, do you have any hot takes on the Fed?
The Fed can be efficient. The Fed can be good. The Fed can do good things, but they can also do bad things. So I think if you automate it, you prevent the really bad things. Okay. 3% to 4%. Would that'd be an automation, yeah.
But would that change our maneuverability? And
I think it should, because oftentimes we overcorrect dramatically. 2008, we overcorrected. Great Depression, we overcorrected. Actually,
was there a Fed back then?
Yeah, there was.
Okay,
that was the first crisis after the Fed, and it was the most disastrous in the economy because the Fed wanted to prioritize at the time because they saw a lot of gold exiting the country. They wanted to keep gold in, so they allowed for a deflationary spiral. So they were worried more about the gold leaving than our economy actually deflating, which caused the Great Depression. That was written in a book by So the creator of the theory, the velocity theory of money, the monetary supply, how that increases and decreases. That formula was created by Milton Friedman, free market economist from the Chicago School, from the University of Chicago, and he basically said that he created a formula for how the money supply works, how it increases, how it decreases. And he wrote a whole book called The Monetary History of the United States, and he went through the Great Depression and through most of the 20th century and said the reasons for most of these crises were, the initial thing may have been caused by a free market speculation, but it was exacerbated by government intervention through mostly the monetary supply. If the monetary supply is kept stable, then these crises would have corrected.
Okay. Do you want to move on towards?
Yeah, totally move on. The next topic, and this is like a little bit more controversial than the other topics, is COVID-19. Were the shutdowns a good thing? Were they a bad thing? So we're going to talk about that. I know we're going to have very disparate opinions on this.
Really? Okay.
I think so. I mean, I think so. I'm not sure. We haven't talked about it yet. So let's start with you, Carter.
Well, like, I feel like there's like a lot of misinformation spreading around the time about like the disease itself. So like when this shutdown then occurred as a result, and like a lot of small businesses closed because of it. And well, like compared to like when the big businesses closed down, it was pretty easy for them to reopen after the shutdown because like they're really big. So, but like compared to like the small businesses which run on like really tight margins, like they couldn't like keep in for like the active overhead expenses, have to shut down and not get like any revenue from people entering and coming in and buying product. So then they, I think around 43 to 45% of all American small businesses were forced to temporarily close their doors during the time.
Yeah, I think even though there were huge implications in the economy, I think that the primary response of lockdowns of most activity, I think was a good thing. Even though it had huge effects, I think the lockdowns, at least from like March to like end of 2020, are probably pretty good. But once we started using masks and we had PPE measures for all people, I think that's when total lockdowns came a lot. And I think also we shifted too, like from total lockdowns to more going back into social distancing and back into like normal life. But I think also after the vaccine came out and after more preventative measures came out, those lockdowns became obsolete. I think going back to that normal life with PPE was good.
I think the lockdowns were definitely necessary because when COVID first came to the U.S., the scientists didn't really know anything. They just knew like, oh, people are dying. We have to enclose people in their homes and have a lockdown. That's just what makes sense to stop the spread. And yeah, I think it was probably necessary, and it was a really big thing and didn't really make sense. But I think in the end, it was definitely better than not having a lockdown.
Okay, so what I would say to that is, in retrospect, so this is like Monday night quarterbacking, right? We're looking back on a crisis, but you also have to consider what people were thinking at the time, right? Yeah. We were sold this idea that this virus was, going to wipe out the earth.
I'm not sure about that.
We were definitely sold that. That's why half the world shut down, because we were really worried about the effects of this crisis, and it maps out really well because, listen, what sells in media?
Negativity.
Fear sells all the time. Hantavirus. We're seeing this thing coming up.
Yeah. COVID 2.0.
COVID 2.0. Oh my gosh, are we going to have to shut down again? Now, are all media outlets like that? No, but when you see profit motive, follow the money, right? When people are scared, people tune into the media. They look at the news. What's happening? The newest experts. What are they saying? So it was definitely a lot of fear. I don't think that the results, looking back, I don't think that we should have done the shutdown. But what we did know at the time, maybe, that we could justify the shutdown because we were sold this idea of mass fear, mass panic. It would justify the shutdown originally. But you had states like, for example, Florida. Florida lifted its brief restrictions, right? It had the restrictions originally because of, the selling and whatever. We don't know what's going to happen. Originally, remember, the lockdown was supposed to last for spring. And then we were supposed to open it back up and whatever. That was
we didn't know anything, so
we didn't know. So that's what they thought, right? So Florida lifted its brief restrictions by fall of 2020 and fully reopened its economy, its schools, while California, for example, even our state, but California more so, maintained stringent, multi-tiered lockdowns, business mandates, and prolonged school closures well into 2021. The result was when adjusting for age demographics, like Florida has some of the oldest populations in the country, and it's one of the primary risk factors. But Florida's age-adjusted COVID-19 mortality rate was entirely comparable to and in some cases better than California's rates of death, even though they were shut down for a much longer time. You also saw Sweden's control group. So Sweden, famously a very progressive economy, Sweden famously rejected the mandatory lockdowns, business closures, and school shutdowns for under 16s, relying instead on voluntary decentralized risk mitigation. So if you're older or whatever, you stay at home or whatever, your own discretion for your own risk tolerance. And what they saw was Eurostat and the WHO data tracking long-term all-cause excess mortality, which is the ultimate metric because it bypasses localized testing and clarification errors. It proved that Sweden emerged with one of the lowest cumulative excess mortality rates in Europe between 2020 and 2023, substantially lower than strictly locked down nations like the UK,
do you know
Italy,
why
and
specifically that having less measures resulted in less deaths? Do you know why this is?
So the reality was that these systems, it's debatable. Different health experts have different opinions on why these things are. But again, I'm not a health expert. I don't know how specifically.
None of us are.
Yeah, exactly. We're just looking, and the fact is that a bunch of the doctors disagree. But I think the main idea there is just we don't really know. I don't think we can say we know. I think that's arrogant to say that we know why. But it's true that it happened. And I think it's important to understand why it happened, but we don't really know why it happened. But it is the case. It's true. So Sweden, there's also the idea that we started improving treatment, and when people were staying at home, they were less exposed to pathogens, making their immune systems more susceptible to disease. So that could be that's a theory. We don't know really, but that's one of the most prominent theories as to why they had lower mortality rates. But it's true. So to say that the lockdowns helped save so many people, did it really? We don't have any evidence that it did.
The stat I'm reading here is that the lockdown saved 60 million lives.
That's, again, where are you getting that from, A? And B, why is it the fact that older populations like Florida, like Sweden, they had lower mortality rates, while other countries with higher restrictions, longer lockdowns, had higher mortality rates?
I have no idea.
Yeah, so you're going to find that, and again, that may just be the fact that you had more affluent economies, right? Like the United States, like these bigger economies that did shut down, right? Had also better hospitalization, et cetera.
That's true.
Than lower income nations, lower economies that maybe didn't do the shutdowns because they didn't have high access to information, and people died a lot there more so than they did in the Western societies.
Lower income countries didn't shut down because they had less information?
No, I don't know specifically, but it is a fact that in lower income nations where you have less access to healthcare, you do die more, especially to disease. That's a fact. But also to go into the economic aspects really quickly. COVID-19 and the 2020 pandemic was one of the largest wealth transfers in our modern day history. You saw massive closures of small businesses and shifting to Walmart, toward these bigger businesses.
Corporate, yeah.
I have the exact stat here. So while hundreds of thousands of independent American small businesses were permanently destroyed, the wealth of U.S. billionaires exploded by over $1.5 trillion.
Really?
Right? So this was one of the most massive wealth transfers in human history, and it benefited the rich way more than it benefited the poor.
So what are those specific shifts? Are those like local businesses shutting down, like your local market shutting down?
Very much, because all businesses, unless you were considered an essential business by government, you were required to shut down. So let's say your business was feeding your family. Too bad, you can't open it anymore. So what do these people do? So what we do, we give them COVID entitlements. We give them these packages, financial packages.
Weren't they called stimulus checks?
Stimulus checks.
I couldn't remember the exact name. But yeah, so we gave them stimulus packages, but that wasn't enough to live.
And should have been more?
It shouldn't have been more, because it's like saying that stimulus should have been more is like saying we should put a bandage on this gaping wound instead of just getting surgery
So
and
you're saying
fixing
that
the wound.
it wouldn't help that much, you're saying?
No, I mean, you're also going to have to, how are you going to pay for that?
Yeah.
You know, how are you going to pay for more stimulus? Increase taxes? So, okay, so now you're going to increase taxes on the people that you're trying to help. That, and plus, or you could print more money, in which case, in the long run, when you have inflation increase, then you're going to have in 5 years, 6 years maybe, you're going to delay the problem, but the problem is going to arise again. And that's the case where government just tries to keep delaying the problem. And then when they're confronted by it, like you do now with, like you did in 2020, with this super high inflation, people were dying because they couldn't afford anything. And they had to rely on these government programs, which then put us into even more debt. So it was just this spiraling upward debt that was insane.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not really sure what to say about that, but I feel like, yeah, that's a problem you just can't solve, and that's a problem that you shouldn't get into the first place. And maybe that, maybe that could have been like prevented without the lockdowns, but yeah.
And it's really tough. Even with the information we had, it was tough.
Yeah, I think a big thing is, again, Monday night quarterbacking. We don't really know. At the time, people were very scared, and justifiably so, right? That's what we were told a lot, and I understand it. So to look back on it now, I would say we shouldn't have done it. But at the time, it was more open ended. Now, do I think we should have ended the lockdown sooner? For sure. But at the beginning, almost everybody locked down all the way at the beginning because it was we didn't know. It was very open ended what could happen. So I think that's a good place to end. I think we end on,
I agree,
on pretty decent consensus. So, that's a wrap on the second episode of the Economic Forum podcast. I want to give a massive thank you to Sai, Kartik, and Tarso for an incredible conversation. We agreed on a lot. We didn't agree on some things, but that's why we're here. That's exactly why we started this podcast, to challenge the consensus and try to come up with better ways to help our economy and better ways
to understand it.
To understand it, yeah, for sure. So if you enjoyed today's discussion and want to learn more about us, subscribe to the channel and follow us on Instagram at @theeconomicforum_WHRHS. Also, make sure to check out my personal Substack newsletter called The Abriel Abstract, where I break down topics like these in full length.
That's good.
And thank you all for tuning in. And right before we leave, I'd like to leave you with a saying that we have here at the forum. When you understand economics, you understand the world. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.